You wanted me to pray, Barney? Love
I
to.
do.
Lord, you are so good, and you are known in the breaking of bread and the prayers and fellowship. And as we break the bread that is TF Torrance and JB Torrance with Stefan, and just um, feast on the work of these dear ones and reflect together. Come, Holy Spirit. Draw us through Jesus Christ into the Father's bosom, and bring whomever you would bring this conversation. Be with Stefan, and thank you for his commitment to meet with us today. And do pray will refresh him, and may it be a refreshing, joyful time. And thank you so much for all that these Zooms mean to me as a pastor, and how they are so blessed and enrich my heart, mind, and soul in the work that you've called me to do. And I know everyone here, bless and lead and shape this time as only you can. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thanks, Matt. So, Stefan, we want to first of all just acknowledge that you are on the far side of the world, that it's the middle of the night, somewhere past 2:30. It's like 2:38 now, or something like that for you there. So, we give you all kinds of room to be tired, but not quite fall asleep. We'll keep nudging you if you start to fall asleep. But we were just commenting before we started here. You have finished your PhD for a year, and now you're teaching. And the name of your school is?
It's called, the short form is SciAx, but the full form is South Asia Institute of Advanced Christian Studies.
Very good. So one of the questions, just to set a number of the context here, most of us have never been to India, and so it seems like things around the world are changing everywhere. And even if you'd been somewhere, 5 or 10 years ago, it doesn't mean it's anything like that there today. So what is the state of being a Christian in India at this point, and particularly an evangelical kind of Christian and doing Christian education? What do those contexts look like?
Yeah, good question. Thanks, Marty. I think it's an exciting time to be a Christian, as well as a challenging time, not unlike your own context. So there are a lot of exciting opportunities to share Jesus with people, as well as some of the challenges that come along with that. Yeah, so in terms of presenting Christ in this context, it's an exciting time. In terms of theological education, I think there's a lot of potential as well on that front. Of course, there's a lot of conversation now about non-formal theological education in this part of the world. How do you train Christian workers who don't necessarily have degrees, but who are gifted, who know the Lord, and who are passionate to communicate Christ? So there's a lot of, I would say, momentum on those lines, but also for formal theological education, which I'm involved in. Of course, it is challenging, because of the increased expenses, just like it is in the West. But there are also a lot of opportunities, like the school that I'm a part of, is one of the premier evangelical institutions in all of South Asia. So we do quite a lot of work. We have degrees from MA all the way to PhD. We have DMin degrees as well. A lot of online programs as well. Before COVID, but also now after COVID, a lot of scope for development and equipping people in their own workplaces through online education. So yeah, some of the similar kinds of opportunities and challenges with theological education in the Western context. Yeah, so broadly speaking, it is an exciting time to be involved in theological education in this part of the world as well. Yeah.
Very good. And again, being in places like China, which I visited, and I've known people who live in China who attempted to just go out and do some education and lost their jobs because of it. In other words, there is in some parts of the world a governmental oppression to Christian presence, Christian study, and all that. But it sounds like you have a freedom to be who you are, to teach things that are appropriate to the Christian faith there in India. Is that true?
Yeah, on the whole, I would say.
Okay. Yeah. So the context of what you're doing in your work here, using the word global evangelicalism, the word global means the whole globe, and so the question evangelicalism, what does evangelicalism mean in India versus what you see that it means in the United States or Europe, maybe, where there are these different kind of meanings? What does it mean to use the term evangelical in the Indian context?
Yeah, I think the term itself can mean several different things. You know, similar things that it can mean in the US, for instance, how the term is intertwined with you know, the whole political angle to it. I wouldn't say that aspect is strong here, but the lack of clarity about what we exactly mean. I think there's scope even in the Indian context to discern the roots of that term and potentially the various kinds of perspectives associated with that term, even in our context. But I would say, broadly speaking, an emphasis on you know, presenting who Jesus is from the scriptures and being faithful to that. You know, focusing both on proclaiming who Jesus is as well as focusing on social justice. Yeah, I would say, broadly speaking, those are the kinds of emphases we would find here. But there is scope to do a study on what the meaning of that term is.
Yeah.
You know, we have quite a few evangelical institutions and organizations, and I think there's a need to recover or define what exactly we stand for as opposed to what we don't. Yeah, so there's scope for more clarity and clarification with respect to that term.
Yeah.
Yeah, but some of the similar kinds of challenges, maybe not as forcefully as, you know, you face it in the US.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Right. And just one other question on just the makeup. It seems as though evangelicalism is aging in the United States. That there are younger youth ministries that reach out that would be evangelical, but the nature of the churches are quite often becoming older congregations. To find young, vibrant pastors like Matt are a bit of a blessing, and I think a bit challenging. So the nature of people throwing out religion generally and the church specifically, and kind of the resistance to that that's there, and for many the whole identification of evangelical with far right, it means that evangelicalism, I think, it has an aging issue where the vitality of younger generations really filling in is something that is of some concern. Do you find that's at all the case there in India?
no, I don't think that's the case here because generally speaking, the country is young. You know, we have a lot of young people in the country. And our churches have various age groups usually. You don't, it's rare to find a church with only one particular kind of age group. You know, you have people from all age groups in churches, all kinds of backgrounds. Yeah, so in that sense, it is an exciting time even to be in pastoral ministry in India because of the opportunities and because of what God is doing.
Right.
All this country generally, this part of the world. Yeah, so we don't face similar kinds of issues that you just suggested, Marty.
Yeah, good. And do you have in your own work people who are Torrance aware, Bart aware? I mean, do you have people around you who you can have conversations with? And I'm just looking for, the title of this book is T.F. Torrance and Evangelical Theology, a Critical Analysis. And part of it is, do we have anybody to critique with? And the book is opening that conversation. But in your context, do you find there are people who understand what you're doing, who they support you and you support them in a constructive kind of way?
Yeah, the college that I teach in, I also studied here. I did a THM here. And it was at that time that I was introduced to Barth. So we have a lot of people interested in Karl Barth, not as many interested in T.F. Torrance. I'm hoping that changes, in the next decade or so.
Yeah.
But more interested in Karl Barth than T.F. Torrance. But people are aware of T.F. Torrance, because of his stature, because of the various areas he explored. People are appreciative, particularly of his emphasis on the fathers, on the creeds, and on various aspects of his theology, including theology science. So they're aware of him,
Yep.
but I haven't found too many people writing on Torrance from the Indian context.
Right.
There are a few. In the article, I interact with a few. Not all of them are based in India, but of course they're writing on Indian, theology or aspects related to Indian theology.
Yeah.
So there are some, and I'm hoping, like I said, more will interact with T.F. Torrance. In the years maybe.
Well, the fact that you are there raises the odds of that happening. And those who are interested in Karl Barth, it's not amiss to believe that T.F. Torrance is not far off the horizon, that he engages issues of science and faith and such that help expand the conversation and would be helpful there in your context. So one can hope that. Have my Karl Barth's Church Dogmatics for Everyone made it to India yet?
Not yet. I'm sure it has made it to India, Marty. I'm sure
Okay.
somebody is using it, but maybe I should use it in some of the courses that I teach.
It is, for people who don't know theology, it's the simplest introduction to theology, not just Barth's theology, but to theological thinking. So anyway, I think it provides a great introduction into Barth, but also really into Torrance, because the methodology of what it is that is developed in that really does point towards what it is that T.F. Torrance himself builds on. So good. So looking then at your chapter in this book on a critical analysis, the question, there are some people who are more critical than others. You weren't overly critical of T.F. Torrance from what I could see.
Yes, not so much in this work.
Yes.
Perhaps maybe critical of the lack of secondary scholarship on Torrance and global themes. But yeah, I mean, the chapter was more an exploration of possibilities.
Yes.
And then, the critique will come later. For instance, some of the similar kinds of critiques come in passing, the lack of engagement with ethics, or, some things along those lines do show up in the chapter. But yeah, the critique is probably not necessarily muted, but yeah, it's not front and center of the work.
Yeah. So Bill has asked, what percentage of Christians are there in India? I was in Japan a few months ago, and there's, I think, 1% in Japan of Christians. What would you say it is in India?
I think the official percentage is probably close to 3%.
3?
Between 2 and 3, I think.
Okay.
And would that include Punjab?
Mm-hmm.
And would somewhere along the line, I want to ask a question about Sikhism and Punjab and Christianity. So
you don't want to ask it now, though?
Well, if you want me to.
Well, I mean, there's no place that's particularly better, so it's on your mind. Stevan's here. I'd say go for it.
Well, the reason I ask is my neighbor across the street is Sikh. He's a retired professor from Punjab of physics, but teaches here at Cleveland State. And he is he wears the bracelet, and is it the turban? Is it the 5Ks? I assume he has the dagger somewhere. I don't know, but he does have the bracelet. It's obvious, and he can't speak to the underwear, but I think there is some sort of various bits that somehow distinguish an upper echelon Sikh from, say, those that don't wear the turban and don't care to. But I'm curious as to those that you've listed that have worked, the Christian missionaries in India. Are you aware of any in Punjab specifically, now or previously, that you could speak to at all?
I mean, I may be aware of things personally, but in terms of, I'm probably aware of things personally, that perhaps, we could talk about later, maybe in an email exchange. That probably would be a better forum to discuss the particular question you asked. So I'm happy to dialogue with you on that.
He asked if he could come to. He asked if he could come to church with me. And I told him, well, what I told him is beside the point. But really, I was wondering why he asked. I asked him that. Why? Which church did you have in mind? Which church would you like to go to? And I told him we were virtual. We were of the virtual. That was back during COVID. And then he later asked, perhaps you would like to come to Gurdwara, their temple, with me. I said, well, I don't speak Sikh. I don't speak Punjabi. So he's also an author, and I have one of his books, but I can't read Punjabi. So anyway, I have this book. You might be familiar with it, called Incarnation and Physics. And they believe in one God. Only that's it. The last guru has spoken. Jesus was one, but now the last has spoken. And once you're dead, you're dead. That's what he told me. But anyway, I thought maybe you might, and I will speak to that later as you suggest, perhaps. Yeah. But I was curious. Go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. Part of the question
seems like a very friendly person. Yeah, nice.
What's that?
The question is how we build those bridges. When somebody has some interest, how do we respectfully build those? I mean, that's part of the question of your article, I think.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. I mean, one of the things I try to do in the article, of course, it's a little more, not necessarily from a practical point of view, but respectfully trying to enter the other's world.
Yes.
And try to understand things from that perspective. That's one of the emphases we find in comparative theology. So rather than being too polemic, the goal is to try and understand, and then, on the basis of that, have a dialogue. Because some of the kinds of interactions are too polemic and are not useful. So you have even evangelical scholars trying to, I guess, incorporate more respect into the dialogue, and that's an ongoing process. So yeah, that's one of the things I try to suggest in the article.
So you think I should go to temple with him, huh?
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Even though it's not in English. Well, he said no.
He may translate.
Yeah.
It's just down the street. I might one day.
Right. Yeah.
I've been to his house
just to learn. I think, that's one of the challenges we all face. Like I remember, when I was doing my MDiv, I did my MDiv in the US, Asbury Seminary. When I took a course in religion, one of the assignments was to go to another place of worship and write about that experience. And I think that was an enlightening experience because obviously I was out of my comfort zone, but it was still good to go and experience, what other people experience. And I think that helps me understand, their religion and their way of life probably a little better. So yeah, I think, I would encourage you to.
I think Torrance might have learned that from George Dragas. who told him that you can't argue with the Orthodox, you listen and learn. You listen. I learned that too. I use that same approach with the Orthodox here. No argument, just listening and immersing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
It's good advice. Yes.
it is a good advice.
Yeah.
Good.
Thank you.
So in your subtitle, some potential generative exchanges with Indian evangelical theology. The question, if you were to do a church history of Indian evangelical theology, what would be your starting point date-wise of saying this is a distinctive Indian evangelical theology that's been developing? Where would you place the beginning of that particular component of theology in India?
That's a good question, Marty. It's a question for, like I was saying, a work on this, because we have, obviously Christianity has been here for a couple thousand years, and we've also had various people from the West come in and bring in their own theological persuasions and perspective. So perhaps maybe let me think. Yeah, that's a good question, Marty. I'll have
Before
to
the
think about
20th
it.
century? I mean, do you think there was anything before the 20th century? I mean, we had Wesley and, the Methodist movement, which in some ways was a founding of the more evangelical side. I don't know that the Puritans, the Congregationalists, those who were coming, I don't know that those particularly, I would put them as part of the history of evangelicalism in the US. So,
yeah. I mean, we've had various waves of the missionary movement in India. I think it would correspond with that.
right.
Like I was saying, Christianity goes back before that as well. But yeah, I mean, that's a question I haven't thought about, Marty. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you for that.
that's okay. The book by Robin Boyd, An Introduction to Indian Christian Theology, and I just looked in the back proper names. He doesn't have either Torrance or McIntyre listed there, but he has 5 references to Karl Barth and 3 to Leslie Newbigin, which Newbigin is somewhat in the tradition as well. So you did mention in your article that both Torrance and Boyd had studied under Barth, so I can see where that's significant. Is there a felt residue of Newbigin's work in India that is there? Because I mean, when you talk missional thinking in the United States, Newbigin is going to be somebody that is at the head of that, and yet there he was in India before he came here, and said, "Wow, we need to think everything through again." So, what is your sense of Newbigin in the conversation about evangelical and even somewhat Barth Torrance, Newbigin-ish kinds of theology? Is there something there?
Yes, particularly in terms of some of the historical debates surrounding ecclesiology. I think he's an important conversation partner. When people come to faith in Christ, should they become a part of the church? And I think Newbigin argued strongly for that, as opposed to having Christians outside the church, or Christians in what's called churchless Christianity. I think Newbigin has a lot to say in that particular context. So he's a significant person from the Indian context in terms of what he did, and his legacy continues. But particularly with respect to ecclesiology, I think he has a lot to contribute there, even now, a lot of wisdom, even now. Yeah.
So may I add to that? I just recently had the parents of one of our church members were visiting from India, and it turned out that the church member's mom was in a confirmation class that was overseen by Leslie Newbigin.
Wow.
So that was pretty wild, to see that. Was my wife Jill and I both have studied New Begin, and Jill had a course on New Begin at Princeton Seminary when Daryl Guter was there. He did a whole course on New Begin. So that was pretty trippy to actually get a direct connection there. And she talked about him and just his travels, and what a remarkable person. Someone told me that this is Robert Walker, Marty, and from Scotland, the guy who wrote the who edited the 2 volumes on Incarnation and Atonement. He said that at some point there was a Torrance. Torrance had spent time with New Begin. Do y'all know anything about that? I don't know. That they met at least once. I don't know, and they had some dialogue. But that'd be interesting to learn more about that Torrance New Begin connection.
I don't know the specifics of that, but I'm sure that that is true. New Begin was also influenced by Karl Barth, and he's big on Michael Polanyi, which I would imagine that Torrance was probably one of the people who helped in that connection. And yeah, I think if you read New Begin, you can see the underpinnings of the relationship going on there. He unfortunately wrote a book kind of against John McMurray, raising questions. McMurray was a little bit of a natural theologian in some parts of what he did, so he didn't take on all of my heroes. But anyway, I think that if you read New Begin, the Gospel in a Pluralist Society, and things like that, you're going to find a very rich set of rootedness in the Bart Torrance tradition there. But that's again something that could stand more work. I'd love it if Participatio did a issue basically on Torrance and New Begin and just played out the kind of themes that were there, which would also play into the question of what did New Begin do in India, and then what did New Begin do coming back from India as he confronted a culture that in some ways was, as big or bigger a challenge maybe than India was for what it was that he was trying to do as a missionary presence in these cultural contexts that are challenging. And what it is that we still have to learn. I think people have a lot to learn still from New Begin, and of course a lot to learn from Bart and Torrance too. But New Begin is clearly the missional face of that tradition, I think, in the same way that Tom Smale is the spirit charismatic Pentecostal face of the Bart Torrance tradition as well. So there are these people that just help press the conversation. And Stavan, what you're doing is you're asking with a generative exchange. You're saying people did begin something there, but we need to learn from the attempts that were made. One of the questions that I want to hear along the way is, what is it that we in the West need to hear from what it is that has been able to happen in India, just by virtue of being a different context, and hence having eyes to see different things that we maybe don't see. And I certainly know that people who've worked in Latino contexts see things about the nature of community and even the way God is perceived that I think we are somewhat blind to in particularly the United States, but really all of the kind of Euro-American ways of being and functioning. So anyway, that's one of the things I'm going to want to hear from you as we go along the way. But just looking then at the generative exchange, that means you're wanting to begin a conversation as a scholar that says, I'm going to make a contribution in India, but I also want a conversation that expands beyond that. So all those who are interested in the contextual work of bringing theology in ways that maintain the integrity of something that is true to God, but also speak to the contexts in which they are finding root, finding seed, and a kind of a respectful thing. The word generative, it's creating something that can happen because of it's there. I was thinking of vineyards where the particular soil and the particular slope, things can happen in some places that can't happen in others, that it's like, wow, that's amazing. How do we think about that? So even in your subtitle, I think that there's something of that I really am wanting your work to help us to learn how to think in those kinds of ways. So when you're getting oriented part here, you didn't call it getting oriented, but I did. You just talked about the nature of a missionary heart. And the T.F. Torrance had that. Do you consider yourself someone with a missionary heart?
Yes, yes, of course. Yes, yes. I think what I was trying to do in the chapter, particularly at the outset, is highlight a gap in at least the secondary scholarship with respect to Torrance and contextual themes. Of
Yes.
course, the missionary background of Torrance is an area that hasn't been explored as much as well. I think Alistair McGrath in his work suggests the possibility for more exploration along those lines. But
Yes.
just generally, I was writing from the perspective of what more can be done. And one of the things I noticed, at least in the, I guess, works on Torrance from majority world scholars, is much of our work focuses on expounding T.F. Torrance himself, because there's just so much within his theology that needs to be articulated. So there's not enough space to then write about how some of the themes we cover in our PhDs relate to our own context. So I'm hoping that this chapter is the start of more, similar kinds of exploration from various perspectives. I know people from the Chinese context who have written PhDs on Torrance and suggested avenues for further exploration. Torrance and Confucianism, dialogue along those lines. So it would be nice to see works like that fleshed out. What would they look like? Of course, in the PhDs, there's probably just enough scope for a dogmatic sketch and nothing more, or just a suggestion. But it would be nice, right, in this phase of the scholarship of Torrance, particularly the secondary scholarship, it would be nice to read more such accounts. So my work is just fleshing out some possibilities from my context. And I'm hoping people from other contexts do the same.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking that the nature of Torrance's scientific inquiry, that the nature of science explores the natural world, but what if one took a missionary approach to the scientific that said, in order to really understand the context, and India is your context, to really understand what it means to do theology here, we need to do some indwelling of the culture, some investigation of the nature of core values, the use of language, the potentials where people might get off, the potentials where they have things that we need to learn how these things function and recognize the value of bringing theological concepts into conversation with those concepts, which I'm just thinking of. I had some students from Mexico who said to the rest of the class one day, you you arrogant white people, I grew up there, I've never seen community like we had in Mexico. They were poor, they had very little, but what they had was each other in a way that you will only ever dream of. And it just kind of awoke in me the sense of the context. Sometimes what's missing also allows for these other things to be indwelt in ways that articulate something like, what is community? Questions like, what does it mean to love one another? What does it mean to serve? I mean, these are all theological concepts that are grounded in the nature of Jesus, the Lord who becomes a servant, right? And so, what does that look like in the context of India? So just to say, if we did further explanation or exploration on thinking of mission with this Torrancean scientific approach, how would that help us to listen better? I mean, you mentioned the listening component a little bit earlier. In some ways, science at its best is a listening exercise, right? And then it makes proposals, or I think this is what's going on here. And then there's correctives within a community. And so that's where you get a community. And so the questions about you in the context of others who can be in that conversation, part of the question of what's missing, and you're bringing, is just a language of Torrance to help ask the question, not just what did Torrance say, but what do we say here in India because of Torrance's not only his theology, but his scientific investigative approach? How does that help us to think missionally here in India?
I guess that's a good question, Marty. It's the way I would answer that from the chapter, particularly by looking at Torrance, I think he empowered others. So he himself does not play a significant role in India, right? Like I mentioned at the outset, he never came to India. I don't think he wrote specifically about India, although I think one of his family members from another generation did visit India. But I don't think he did, or anybody in his immediate family. But what he did do, particularly through his PhD supervision, was he empowered others. And Robin Boyd is an excellent example of that. The thesis that Robin Boyd did was way ahead of its time in the sense in which he encouraged what we would call local theology today, right? He empowered local theologizing, which was not common in that day, particularly because of our colonial history and, kind of a sense of, at least from our perspective, Western imposition, even theologically. One of the goals of, I guess, theology in this part of the world has been to self-theologize, to theologize on our own, not just focus on strategies, but also to do theology. And I think Torrance, in his own way, encouraged that. Of course, Boyd's thesis was 700 pages. I don't know how he got away with that. I don't think today people get away with something like that. But it's such a significant work. I can't think of any other work, Marty, even now, that compares to Robin Boyd's work in terms of what he did. And I think there's a need to update his work. I mean, there are some other works. Sunan Sumitra is an example of an Indian theologian who does something similar to what Boyd did, but there's a need, to expand the conversation partners and the theologians that Boyd interacts with, and provide a revised version of his work, which hasn't been done, but it continues to be used in the Indian context at the MDiv level in all kinds of seminaries. So
and part of what I'm wanting to do is to just live into the nature of the book within which the chapter appears is a critical analysis. And part of the criticism is not being critical of, but just saying we critically need the missing pieces that you've identified. So in saying that we could think about the nature of the scientific aspect as part of the missional heart that needs to go beyond, build on Torrance, but go beyond it. It's just to say, it's totally fine to find there are things that are missing, and then to put out propositions from what was done that pointed in a direction that was never fulfilled, and to say, if this conversation here, which we will post, if people along the way stumble across this and say, never thought of taking Torrance's scientific method as a missionary agenda, what would that look like? And to take it into these different cultures, that would be expanding the conversation in a way that I think you're wanting to do. So you're partly noticing what's missing, but you're also noticing what's missing so that others can build on that.
Yeah. Like in our context, the word missionary is not useful anymore because it brings all the wrong images. People don't associate missionary with the good thing in our part of the world. I don't know what it's like.
What word would you use? What would you say instead of that?
I'm not quite sure.
Yeah.
But the word missionary brings with it a lot of baggage. So it's a term that requires constant clarification. So in that sense, it's not useful. I'm not saying it's not a useful term at all. It's just because it will be misunderstood in our part of the world. I think one of the things that's needed is to find terms that try to communicate what is best in that term. Obviously not trying to impose, or I don't think that's the way in which we intend that term. I mean, I don't think that's what we mean, but that's what it's associated with here. And part of the goal of being an intellectual evangelist like Torrance was in his context is to come up with terms that remove some of the baggage, unnecessary baggage. But I mean, I'm just saying that since we're talking about this at the very outset, Torrance was a missionary, an intellectual missionary, as it were. or a missionary to the academia. And in that sense, people with a similar kind of heart face the challenge of what to do with terms. Like in the Western context, is evangelical an important term? And I think there's a lot of debate there about recovering the best in that term and removing the baggage. Similarly here, the term would be missionary, and how do we remove the baggage and yet keep the term, or do we come up with other terms? So those are some of our challenges here.
Well, you used the word encourager, which, I mean, that's a nice replacement for missionary. It's someone who comes and encourages people. What encourage in what? In knowing God and knowing the place where we are, in finding ways to be for the good of those people because God is for these people. So encourager is a word that came spilling out of your mouth that has interesting implications for, what do we call these people? And then how do we hold them accountable to do that and not to bring in all the other baggage of those ways that were really insensitive, maybe, to the culture in which they were doing work. They were transposing a culture into that culture rather than really bringing a word that spoke and invited into knowing God and not merely a Western culture.
Yeah, and that's the genius, I think, of what Robin Boyd did in his work.
Yeah,
He tried to explore how Indians have theologized and documented that.
right.
And like I said, that was not common in that day, particularly for a Western missionary to do something like that.
Yeah,
And the fact that his work continues to be used in Indian seminaries today, is it 60 years after he wrote that work? About
yeah,
60 years after he wrote that work, speaks
yeah,
volumes about how important that work is. And
yeah.
I'm so glad that it's published in an abridged form and not 700 pages long. But
This is the short
yeah,
version.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's the published version of his work. But the
yeah.
PhD is available online.
Okay. Bill, I see that hand there.
Well, Stavan, your father was president of ATA, is it? Was that your father?
He was not president. He was the secretary of Asia Theological Association. Yeah, he worked with ATA for about 20 years. Yeah,
and all over Asia. Yes.
all over Asia. Yes, yes.
Yeah. And I wonder, could you speak to his influences?
On me, or generally, or
Who influenced him, and then who influenced him and his theological journey?
His theological influence. I was curious.
Yeah. So my father grew up in the Methodist Church in India, where you had people, different people who were pastors of that church who impacted him greatly. There was a person called Sam Kamalesan. I don't know if that name rings a bell. He recently passed away, but he was a pastor in India, very effective evangelist. So my dad came to know the Lord under his ministry. Sam Kamalesan, he passed away in the US, so he spent a few years in the US as well. So anyway, the Methodist Church influenced my dad greatly. And then my dad joined the Free Methodist Church, which broke off of the Methodist Church in the 1860s, and has had a presence in India for more than 100 years. So my dad joined the Free Methodist Church and then went to seminary. He sensed a call, so he left his government job and pursued full-time theological studies, prepared himself for that. So the influence of the Methodist Church, then I would say the Free Methodist Church, which he was associated with, Union Biblical Seminary. I don't know if that name rings a bell, but it is another premier evangelical seminary in India. It was started by the Free Methodist Church, and today it's an ecumenical. It's run by several denominations. So my dad taught at Union Biblical Seminary for a few years. And then he did his studies at Asbury Seminary, He did his master's there, and then he did his PhD at Michigan State University. Ted Ward, I don't know if Ted Ward rings a bell. Theological educator Ted Ward. He used to teach at Michigan State University and impacted many Christian leaders all over the world. But I would say his influence played a significant role in my dad's life. Apart from some of the other institutions that I mentioned and churches. Obviously, my dad played a significant role in my own journey as well. Not just his beliefs, but his lifestyle. Both my dad and mom. My mom recently passed away, in March earlier this year. But they both, have impacted the lives of their children and several people all across India and other parts of the world as well. But yeah, my dad joined ATA, was it in the early 90s? Yeah, so I don't know if you know about ATA, but it's an accrediting organization. It provides accreditation to various institutions just to make sure institutions keep their standards on par with what is expected. So with that work, my dad traveled to several countries and as part of the accreditation process and assisted various seminaries to encourage them and to journey with them in improving their own standards of theological education. Yeah, so theological education is very close to my dad's heart. Yeah, and I would say he impacted me quite significantly.
Wow.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Do you have siblings who are also in theological education?
No, both of my sisters are nurses, but
Okay.
yeah, very very keen on knowing their faith and communicating their faith to others. They both live in the US. Yeah.
Huh. Yes, well, there's a whole world of connection. I mean, there's this guy named Luke who wrote the longest gospel in the Bible, and he was a doctor, and he kind of thinks like a doctor training nurses in what he does in that gospel. So I always thought we need to do more work on Luke for nurses, living on the front line at the margins of culture. So anyway, very good. Well, thank you for that story. Your dad is still alive then?
He is, yes.
Yes. I'm sorry to hear about your mother. That's never easy, but God gives us the grace to keep going and recognize the what they have brought, which you certainly seem to have gained much from both your parents. So the whole global theology, I'm looking at point 3, it's still at the beginning here, and active voices, little on continental themes. So global theology, I've only recently seen dictionaries of global theology. So I'm just becoming aware that there's an attempt to recognize not just kind of individual contexts like the United States or India, but there's something about global. Can you say anything about just the state of what we would mean by global theology?
Yeah, global theology also acknowledges how the Christian demographic has changed and is changing, and is not the same as it was 100 years ago. The majority Christian population does not live in the West. It lives in Asia and Africa. So in that sense, global theology recognizes the need to expand the conversation partners in theological discourse, I guess commensurate with what is happening all across the world, right? Christianity is spreading all over the world. And like I was saying, the demographic, I guess, needs to be taken into account, even in the way we theologize. But that's not always the case.
Yeah.
Right? If you look at major theological works, not all of them are conversant with theologians from other parts of the world. And I think some theologians are intentionally trying to correct that. People like Karkainen, Marty Karkainen. If you look at his work, he's conversant He's doing systematic theology, but he's conversant with religious perspectives. He's conversant with theologians from the majority world. And I guess in that sense, there's a need for theology to be global, not just in what we believe because of the demographics, but because of the need to, I guess, interact with theology globally, and that should be evidenced in our own works. So I think that's still a challenge. We don't necessarily find that all across the board, but we do find some good examples that others can emulate. We too can emulate.
So it's more of an openness to a conversation than it is something that has any consensus power or anything like that. It's saying we need to be in a global conversation that attends to the fact that we have these many different contexts, and we need the conversations to learn from each other as we expand that conversation. Is that a fair kind of assessment of what?
Right. I think people like Timothy Tennant, who champion this as well, recognize the need for what he calls the ontic expansion of Christianity, and by that he means, we need one another. We need to learn from one another to be edified. And if we don't, if people remain in their own ghettos, then others don't benefit from that. So there's a sense in which all of the body of Christ is important for our own growth intellectually, but also relationally. Global theology is documenting, I guess, in one sense, how Christians all across the world are thinking theologically on various themes. I guess that could be one way to put it. And the emphasis on theology to be global is something that is probably emerging as a need, even from the Western context. Like I was mentioning, people like Karkain intentionally include more conversation partners, to show awareness, but also respect,
Yeah. And it also, this is a question rather than a statement. Does it also include, for example, in India, the engagement with Hinduism, Sikhism, and things like that? In other words, is part of the global theological conversation to say it's easy to come up with barriers. What does it look like to build bridges?
Yes, it would include that. It would include awareness, deep engagement, not just superficial engagement. Sometimes what we get is just superficial engagement, which is very polemic. And I think the deep engagement doesn't necessarily exclude the need for convincing, and persuasion, but it begins with understanding, deep understanding. And I think that's one of the goals, particularly in the times in which we live. We need to really take time to understand where people are coming from. It may shed light on why people are acting the way they do. Of course, there's always a historical precedent for certain things. There's a history behind certain reactionary movements. And I think, Christians need to take the time to understand that without giving up the need to seek to persuade. But I think we need to start off with respect and understanding, which has not always been the case. Even theologically, you find many Christians trying to recover the goodness in their own culture, because in the past they were told that every aspect of their culture is not good. And I think the recovery of our own identity as people of culture is an ongoing process in the Indian context.
May I just add something?
Yes.
When I was preaching last Easter, and I was very, very aware that it was probably being there was a larger crowd, there were probably folks of various faith backgrounds there. And in the course of proclaiming the resurrection of Christ, I referred to, I was kind of saying, we can learn from other religions. We need to try to learn from other religions, but of course, no other religion has the resurrection like we do. But I was essentially, that's what I was saying. But and just saying how does someone's worldview handle the realities that the resurrection handles, right?
Mhm.
But the fact that I said in the course of the sermon, we can learn from other religions, it caught some of our people, it caught their ears, and they were like, well, there was I think some element, nothing horrible, no huge blow-ups, but I could tell that certain people were like, that was new, that idea, that kind of that posture of learning. And I tried to talk about it later as a missiological posture, this idea that that's not inimical to, like you say, to persuading, but it's a posture of learning and openness. And I think it's exciting, but I think the sense of excitement about that does connect with how big your Christology is to begin with, and how if you're really grasped by the kind of emphasis of Torrance and Bart, you're less threatened by that idea, and you want to learn and make those connections. But anyway, I think that's a huge thing to recover in our multicultural, multi-religious context of Northwest United States, where I have a Hindu family across the street from me, I have a Hindu family on the other side of me, and I have a Muslim family on the other side of me. How do we engage with that? But like you just said, a learning posture is so important. But I think for some evangelicals, that sounds a little suspicious.
Yeah, it does. It does, because we're threatened.
Right.
Perhaps we're operating out of fear.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think there's a lot of fear associated with conversations surrounding faith that I think we need to come out of. Of course, it takes a lot of courage to truly learn another perspective. Like I remember Timothy Tennant, when I was studying at Asbury Seminary, encouraging, all of us to learn about Islam, so that we would be more conversant with it.
Right.
So he encouraged us to read texts as well. And of course, he's somebody who's very familiar with various religious perspectives and remains convinced about the truthfulness of Christ and the uniqueness of Christ. So I think we can have both. We can have respect, but also affirm the uniqueness of Christ.
Mm.
But there's a lot of fear associated with what would happen if we truly learned another perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That word fear. Yeah.
Fear is huge. Fear is huge. I was in Japan in October, and to really be immersed in the Shinto and Buddhist traditions there, and the way they're not afraid of each other. In fact, they're kind of integrated. And to recognize that there's much about what it is that they're pursuing, which has created a very safe and peaceful culture. And so to say, the United States, peace and safety are not words that one uses very often, particularly in the larger cities. But even in Tokyo, you see women walking at 10 o'clock at night down dark alleys with no fear. And so to go, what is that about? And there are elements, profound elements, that the religion is integrated into everyday life, including waiting for the walk light to turn the color before anybody walks across the street. It is an integrated respect for the nature of the rules. Kata is the word they use for it. But so anyway, to say there is just this learning about other cultures, that doesn't mean you have to do all of it, but at least you know how to relate to them and where they're coming from in the doing of it, and you can begin to extend respect, which I think is part of the positioning of what it is that we do. Simply show up making sure that we are being Christian, that we're being the neighbor, without asking the question whether they are whatever they're supposed to be. So that is very,
and the fact that God is already at work. We don't go to a place where God has not already gone, right? The
yes.
Missio Dei, I think Torrance would affirm that, and perhaps subtly in what Robin Boyd is doing in his work by encouraging or bringing to light the Christian engagement with Christ.
Yes.
Of course, it begins with Hindu perspectives on Christ, his work. It starts there in Robin Boyd's work.
Right.
But also, how have Christians interacted with Christ and tried to appropriate Christ in their own context, and you have various perspectives on that.
Yeah.
But the fact that, God is already at work is a good reminder to all of us. Good corrective as well at times.
Yeah, and it's not just an idea, it's how you actually live that. I've said to people, you would do a lot more as a missionary if you went and knocked on your neighbor's door and said, you're my neighbor and I don't know your story. Tell me your story and I'll tell you mine, that in that just openness to hearing and telling our stories, people would hear a lot more about the living Christ than they would with any kind of a system of trying to twist their arm or ear or whatever it is that we're twisting. And that is the listening posture and the willingness to share without fear. I mean, it's the not fear part that is the power of that.
Yeah.
Amen.
The idea of contextual theological themes. I just wonder if you, in reading Torrance, partly what he brought, which he did bring some things that were picked up, but maybe things that are contextual theological themes that people might not be aware of, that when you're in India, these are contextual theological themes that one needs to pay attention to that wouldn't be obvious.
Yeah, so some of the things I cover in the chapter, in the first section, just theological reception history, how have Christians thought about Jesus in our context? Christianity didn't begin with me or with this generation. I think just the willingness to learn from our forebears. I think that's one thing, and recovering that in our particular context, removing the baggage associated with the total rejection of culture or even religion. I think needs to be corrected with what we were talking about, this learning posture, the willingness to affirm certain aspects of what other religions teach as well, is an important perspective, I think, that comes with deep learning, right? I mean, you can't truly study another perspective and come away thinking everything about it is bad.
Right.
So that would be one broad contextual theme. Another one would be just the social justice on so many levels, various injustices, and the need, for justice, particularly in our Indian context with the caste system, and the manifestations of that, sadly, even in churches, is something that happens even today. So I think before we look outside, I think we need to look inward and try to address our own issues, within the Christian community. I think that's one of the major challenges, is how do we address injustice in our own context, in our four walls, as it were. I'm speaking about the Christian community, broadly speaking. And also this, the need to truly interact with others. Like I was mentioning in the latter part, how do we interact with other faiths? The only way to do so is by learning and then seeking to persuade, rather than just going without any knowledge of another, religious perspective and persuade. I think those are some of the broad issues. But generally speaking, poverty and religious pluralism, kind of big picture kinds of issues that any theologian in this part of the world has to face and address and interact with, because these are realities that are ubiquitous. Yeah.
And it has been in our area here, homelessness has been hugely on the rise. I mean, you can't go down the streets of Seattle for a block without seeing, whole tent communities of people who are homeless. I don't know what the history of that is in India. There's a lot of people in India. I think it's the most populous country in the world. Is there just a sense of the presence of the poor and the homeless that has any impact on theological thinking?
It does. Like I was saying, poverty, and the manifestations of that in some of the things you talk about is all over. You can't go outside your home without being faced with that. And we have to live with that, but also try to do something about it. Through generosity, but also through sustained ways of addressing the issue, rather than band-aid kind of ways of addressing it. So it is challenging. Which is, I think, one of the good things that Christians have done in the country is invest in hospitals and schools. Usually Christians are known for that, which is a great legacy. Because if people want to go to good schools, it's usually, schools that have been started by Christians. or Catholics, I'm including them as well when I say Christians. Hospitals and schools, that's the legacy we have, where, even when we plant churches, usually the focus is on an all-round or holistic kind of care for people, uplifting people from the margins, and providing skills and opportunities. So we need to continually think about holistic ways of reaching out to people and helping people.
Yeah.
But it is ever present, Marty, and
Yeah.
it's not easy to address.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are places like Australia. When I was in Australia and visited most of the major cities there, I didn't go to Perth, but there's no homelessness there. It's like, okay, what are they doing that we're not doing? Because there's something different here. So I don't know what it is, but I think that's part of the global conversation, is where people have figured out something. How do we learn from each other those things to address those kinds of social issues? So I think the need is large for those big conversations. On the Torrance's theological footprint in India, we've got a deer walking by in front of my window here. The fact that he never visited India, do you think he listened to the stories of people who were from India? In other words, sometimes visiting is an indwelling in it, but sometimes there are people who are just good at hearing the stories, and they become intuitive, and theological intuition is a big theme for Torrance. Do you have any sense that Torrance developed any theological intuition about India, even though he hadn't visited there?
I think he may have had interactions with people who lived and worked in India. We know that because he mentored Robin Boyd, and Robin Boyd, was a missionary to India. I think he did his PhD study on his first furlough, I think, if I'm not mistaken. I mentioned that in the chapter.
Yeah.
So he would have obviously had interactions with people like Boyd and shared stories. Of course, Torrance always thought of himself as, as a missionary, even though he was an academic.
Yeah.
The missionary calling never faded from his life. So I'm sure he would have had conversations with people, exchanged notes, and appreciated the work of what people like Boyd were doing. So I'm sure, although I can't document it, Marty, there's nothing that I came across. It would probably have to be in some of the secondary sources. I don't know if anybody wrote about Torrance and Leslie Newbegin, but it would be in sources like that where we would get nuggets of information.
Yeah.
But from what we know about him and his family background, it would be easy to think that he would have had such conversations and learned from them.
Right. Yeah, it's just part of the broader sense of what it means to be a theologian. It's you bring something, but also you learn to listen so that what you have to bring meets with the people with whom you're hoping to see formation and a true learning process, transformation process really being played out. The Scottish piece, that he was in a sense part of a broader history of Scottish. Do you think that has been helpful all along, or has there been a resistance to Scotland being kind of a foreign intellectual, don't really know us culture? I mean, are they seen as invaders, or is there the intellectual tradition of Scotland that is valued because they brought us ways of thinking? I mean, what is your general sense of what the Scottish cultural piece has done playing out for Torrance particularly, but for India generally, in receiving Scottish theologians and thinking?
Yeah, I mean, like I was saying, the baggage is probably going to dominate any kind of conversation about any foreign influence in India, is the colonial history, right? So you can't remove or disassociate that aspect. But what I think these Scottish workers did, Christian workers, was to plant these schools and colleges that continue to play a significant role in India. Like I provided a footnote there of significant personalities who went to these schools. And I'm sure they would speak highly of these schools. So I think that's the legacy, and the fact that they continue to exist just speaks about what they valued. So when they
Yeah.
came to India, they planted schools, and I think it was a wonderful thing that they did that.
Yeah. And have you felt, this is the flip side of the coin, have you felt when you've gone into particularly the British context that they've had a curiosity about India, where there was a desire to learn from you as somebody who is there and comes with this knowledge that's bridged by Torrance into that context? Do you feel that there is an openness and a wanting to learn from the Indian context?
I think so. Of course, I went to a school that had, people from all over the world,
Yes.
Oxford Center for Mission Studies. So there is, I think, in the DNA of that school or that college, this global theology that we were talking about,
Yeah.
the need to learn from one another to edify the larger body of Christ. And in conversations that I have had, like I see more, people writing works in theology, wanting to interact with, I guess, theological concerns from the majority world. So I see a sense which is evident even in their academic works of people wanting to learn,
Yeah.
which I think is good, is a good sign.
Yes.
Of course, you have baggage both ways, I'm sure. But particularly from the Indian perspective, the colonial baggage is still there.
Yeah.
So there's, you have
Yeah.
to see anything in light of that history.
Yeah.
It colors it to a certain extent.
Yeah. And my question is partly, how do we acknowledge the baggage that is there and then also envision what it looks like to move beyond it in mutually respectful kind of ways where both can benefit each other? So that's part of the trying to chart a future there in a sense.
Yeah, and in a sense, what I want to encourage is this East-West dialogue. I think that's important, rather than remain in our own silos or ghettos. It's important to have these dialogues, and you have some examples of people who do this practically as well. Western theologians who are keen to learn from majority world theologians, and they have forums for that. In this part of the world, I think these are wonderful avenues, and people like Michael Horton is what I'm thinking of, and his organization, that is championing what can be called East-West dialogue, where people from the West, particularly theologians, are wanting to learn from, majority world theologians and vice versa. And they're also working on a 5-volume series. I think, is it a 5-volume or something with, is it Erdman's, I think?
Could be.
So, yeah, they're going to publish the fruit of this kind of interaction. So that'll be a work to look out for as well. Yeah.
Have you been to any of those?
I have, yes.
And what stands out to you and what's happening there? What are they able to achieve in one of those conferences?
I think just learning, right? They come there with this attitude to learn. I think that's one of the things that stands out.
Yeah.
Of course, it provides refreshment for everyone, just an opportunity to grow in our own areas of interest and expertise. But this, what I was talking about, this East-West dialogue and the opportunity it creates for deep learning. I think that's one of the things that stands out here.
Yeah, very good. So you then go on to take 3 different people and trace the way that they, in a sense, have been able to further what they do because of their relationship with T.F. Torrance at different levels, of course. But so Boyd is one of them. He did his PhD on the place of dogmatic theology in the Indian church. And I'm just wondering, Torrance, to be able to do that, would have had to have had some knowledge of the Indian church just to be able to guide Boyd in doing his research. Wouldn't, I mean, is that true?
That's something I would like to find out, but I'm assuming it's true. Yes.
Yeah.
At least he tacitly approved what Boyd did in his work.
Yeah.
Because Boyd is not just, he's providing some kind of methodology for others to follow as well, in terms of how to do theology in the Indian context. And the fact that it's such a significant work does speak about Torrance's involvement to a certain extent as well. Although
Yeah.
what kind of involvement Torrance has, we don't really know, because Boyd doesn't talk much about it, even in the work.
Yeah.
So it would be interesting to hear about people who knew Robin Boyd, to understand a little more of how he interacted with his PhD mentors.
Yeah.
But the
And he's
fact that
died
they
now?
approved the work, what?
He's died now. Boyd is
Yes,
gone.
yes, he passed away. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So he was also a missionary family. What was his original country of origin? Where was he from?
I think Australia, if I'm not
Okay.
mistaken.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Irish. No, he's Irish, I think. Yeah, he's Irish. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's all very interesting too, just to study the roots of those cultures in the
Yeah.
background, the issue of the Irish challenge between the Catholic and the Protestants and how that affects the way that he engages caste systems and things like that. And just what theologically he sees through his own experience would be a very interesting study.
Yeah.
The nature of Karl Barth for both Boyd and Torrance. Did Boyd write anything specifically on Karl Barth?
He did. Not monographs. I mean, in one sense, Boyd says everything he wrote was in response to a question Karl Barth asked him, right? What is the
Right.
significance of Barth's big dogmatic works for India? And in some sense, Boyd says all of his writings are a response to that particular question. But he did write a few works, not anything substantial, Marty. I'm talking about explicitly related to Barth. I think he wrote a review of one of his books, and then just spoke very highly of Karl Barth and his investment and involvement in Robin Boyd's theological thinking.
Huh.
Yeah, I have a work of some of his essays, Boyd's essays, where he writes about Barth in some of them. But in one sense, all of his work can be viewed as a response to the influence of Barth in his thinking. Yeah.
Well, that would be a good essay for you to write in Scottish Journal of Theology. I'm thinking that could go in there. At the American Academy of Religion, there was somebody who talked about a Chinese theologian who only had one of the church dogmatics, but he took it to heart and really was a huge influence in China, not only in theology, but actually, took on other kinds of leadership roles, but really left a significant Karl Barth influence just working with one.
Wow.
So to see the impact of what somebody with, a bit of thinking that provides trajectory that makes a difference, it's quite exciting for that. You distinguish between dogma and dogmatics, and if I'm hearing that right, dogma is kind of a bunch of opinions, and dogmatics is what Torrance calls the heuristic investigation of God. And so that alone, to get that distinction, could be a huge contextual kind of engagement as, what are we doing here? Where you're not just memorizing definitions and opinions, but you're actually learning to think through the nature of who is this God who comes and how does this God function in our context, and really having the bridge being there.
Yeah.
You have the 5 points. These were his 5 points to think of dogmatic theology for India. This was part of his doctorate. Is that right?
Right.
So there was some sense of asking about existing or the existing prolegomena to Indian dogmatics, and that's the nature of what had already been done.
Yeah.
Yeah. And did he find that there was much that he could build on? In other words, was he able to say, we've got this foundation here, we just need to build a house on it? Or did he find that he actually that wasn't there and they needed to start pouring a foundation?
I think he did provide the foundation and build the house to a certain extent, because he documented how Indians have theologized.
Okay.
And what he goes on to write in his work is how a systematics in the future will be done by Indians who are aware of their own context, their religious context, intellectual context,
Right.
things along those lines. So basically, theology that is not a Western imposition is what he was envisioning, and a theology that where Indians theologize themselves on how they have encountered Christ and written about those experiences, how they've tried to appropriate Christ to their own culture. Of course, there are debates along the way. What kinds of terms do you use for the incarnation, and how do you associate those concepts with concepts from other religious perspectives? So what Boyd is doing, and of course we need to understand the context, right? What he's doing may seem common now, but it wasn't when he was writing it, right?
No.
He was championing something.
Yeah.
I refer to Kirstine Kim in one of the footnotes where she says what Boyd did was the first of its kind. So when we understand that background, I think he's providing impetus for others as well to build on what he's doing.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
But
even
he's basically encouraging Indians to think for them theologically for themselves. And he's discerning how they've done that and documented it in one source. That continues to be useful. Yeah. Sorry, you were saying
it's
something.
that encouraging word again, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Which encouraging sees what's there and also sees what can be. So, I mean, that's part of it. It requires a kind of wisdom looking back and also a wisdom that looks forward.
Right.
When he hit the third point, the need for Indian confessions for Indian churches, one always wonders when you're doing confessions to what degree the culture shapes the confession and to what degree you maintain a sense of something being true to the person of Christ. So I'm just wondering how, when I was in New Zealand, there was just a huge thing for indigenous theology. And at some level, Jesus was only a name that was carried over. Everything else was just downloading what the values of the indigenous people were. To the point you said, yeah, you're talking about Jesus here, but I'm not sure that anything you're doing really reflects who he is or what it looks like for him to show up in New Zealand. So was Boyd able to think contextually in India and maintain the integrity of what would be called, a Torrancean Bardian theological rootedness? And how did he make that bridge?
I mean, here we have to speculate a little since Torrance approved the thesis. I think he tacitly approved what Wright was writing. What Boyd was writing about there. The point that Boyd is making is, once again, the need for Indians to theologize in a way that speaks to their own intellectual context, which obviously includes Indian philosophies and religious perspectives. So how do we communicate the Nicene Creed, for instance, in a way that incorporates Indian philosophy into it? I think Boyd would encourage something like that, where if Indians felt the need to theologize, just like the early church theologized with the Greek philosophical concepts, can we theologize with Indian philosophical concepts to make sense of who Jesus is for our context? Not to make sense, but to communicate who Jesus is for our context. I think Boyd would encourage that kind of approach. But yes, the challenge is how do we remain rooted, with what the church has always believed. That is a challenge, and questions will be raised. But you do find some examples, for instance, where people write creeds to address injustices they face. So, for instance, you find some creeds from particularly certain strands of Indian theology, one of which is Dalit theology, and you find some creeds that they write to address oppression that they face. So, in a sense, creeds should speak as well. I mean, the argument is creeds should speak as well to contemporary realities that people face now. But it's open to question about how they do justice to, what the church has always believed about certain things. So that's an ongoing debate. But the point I think Boyd encourages or supports is the need for Indians to write creeds in such a way that reflect their own intellectual and philosophical context, particularly in terms of dialoguing with them.
Yeah. I'm remembering, I think it was J.B. Torrance who talked about visiting India and just seeing people on the streets who were just, basically being treated with, no respect. And he said, the few that I was able to talk to, my whole thing was to hold out my hand and say, to grant them their humanity. And for J.B. Torrance, the granting of humanity to somebody who had been discounted in a culture, for him was a deeply Christological, practical, spiritual exercise, and that to give them his hand and to acknowledge them was all a living of theology to people who weren't being granted. And I just think of that as potentially something of, what is it that we recognize that we can do to know who Jesus is as the one who is for all humans. And so what is oppressive in every culture is going to be different. And so to have the eyes and ears to see that does require a rootedness in Christ and a willingness to see. We get a lot of Indians here because they're really smart, and so they come and work for Microsoft and Amazon and some of the big companies here. So there's quite an Indian population of intellectuals. So it's interesting just the nature of, if you were to take the Indians here, they're a totally different slice than you might get in another place in the world where they're for another reason. So it's just interesting too what the slices maybe within Indian culture are doing in the diaspora, the dispersing of Indian people who have all of these contributions that they're able to make, and how that creates a global engagement that's diverse. There isn't just one, in a sense, kind of Indian that we would be talking about. So I think there's so much to learn about the diversity within any people group as they're displaced or replaced or whatever in different contexts, that are an interesting piece of the conversation.
Yeah,
and that's some of Matt's neighbors, is those Indians, I'm sure, work at Boeing, because he's just very close to Boeing. And
yeah. Bill, you had a question. I think you raised your hand a few moments ago.
I guess I was a little premature. It was as to point 5, if I may speak to that.
Please.
I just wanted to say how much I appreciate this, where you wrote that, quote, India's immediate need, this is Boyd, is not so much for an Aquinas or a Calvin, but for men like Clement and Origen, men of adventurous mind and vivid imagination, preachers like Sundar Singh. Now, he was early 20th century, yes?
Right.
Do you know much about him? Have you studied him? What's his background?
Sundar Singh, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. So, he's a Christian mystic. He would come under that category. But he came to faith in Christ and presented the gospel in a culturally appropriate manner.
Yes.
So he would be somebody who championed an Indian way to present Christ. How do you present Christ without Western baggage? Sundar Singh would be one example of that. Obviously from Punjab, somebody who came from that context and presented the gospel of Christ in an Indian way. That would be one way to characterize him. But significant personality, particularly in terms of how do you communicate Christ in an Indian context. Of course, the context in which he was living was dominated by Western expressions of Christianity. So he stood out.
He was from, did you say he was from Punjab?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, really? Maybe that's my bridge to Dr. Gurbash Singh Bandal. Yeah, I see that he ends the quote, Sundar Singh, who can convince men's minds in their own language and win their hearts.
Yeah.
I like that. 700 pages, though. That's a lot. What? Would any libraries? Does Ashbury have his book? Did it?
No. His book is an abridged form of his PhD thesis,
Oh,
Robin
oh,
Boyd's
oh.
book.
Okay.
His
The
PhD
quote
thesis
that I
is the-
use there is not from his PhD, it's from one of his essays. The quote that you just read is from one of his essays where he talks about, whether Barth is relevant for India or not, or Barth's theology. It's in that context. So that's one of his essays. It's in a compiled work. I think the bibliography is there in one of the footnotes.
The footnote.
Did you say his doctorate's online though? It's accessible online?
Yeah. He did it from the University of Edinburgh, right? So that's available online. At least it used to be, but the website, you probably have to go to the college website. I don't think you can access it from Ethos, which we used to. I think there was some issue with Ethos is currently inaccessible, but if you go to the college website, I think you can access it from there.
And then you could do an electronic search with that, because that would be digital.
Yeah, but the quote is not from the PhD. The quote that you just referenced, Bill, that's from another work.
The footnote is the place of the dogmatic theology in the Indian Church, page 685.
Oh, okay. Okay, so that is his PhD then. Yeah.
Anyway, I like that quote a lot. I just wanted to.
If it's digital though, you can get it and just go right to it.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Oh, well, I wonder if archive.org might have it.
Well, it should be at the University of Edinburgh. He said they post their doctorates there at the university, so you should be able to go directly to University of Edinburgh to the library archives.
Yeah.
That'll be the easiest way to find it. Easier than the Internet Archive. Go to the horse's mouth, so to speak.
Well, I think you might have access to that. I don't have. I'm not a.
Everybody does. I think
Really?
there's no firewall for that. No paywall for that.
Yeah, it's freely available, Bill.
At Edinburgh. Really? Oh, thanks.
I've downloaded from Edinburgh both Bart and Torrance doctorates before.
Whoa, that's good to know.
Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff there to be found. We'll have to do a session on getting things out of these libraries where they're available. So
I read too, speaking of Punjab, that the Christians there are looked down upon as sort of a lower class. Do you know, maybe I don't want to get off on a tangent, but I just wondered if you know anything in that regard. Punjab is probably not your. Yeah. No, that's another conversation.
That would be true all across the country.
Yeah.
You have many people who have come to faith in Christ from the lower strata of society.
Yes.
So it would be a common perception about Christians from many. But I mean, when people come to faith in Christ from a Christian perspective, one of the challenges is, do we continue to view them from within the lens of caste? And that's a challenge the church faces. Sometimes the church is guilty of viewing people from that lens as well, which is something we have to overcome as Christians. So rather than blame others, I think we have to get our own ship in order. But yeah, generally that would be a perception many people would hold on to. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not justifying the perception, but that would be a perception nonetheless.
Your next section you move on to, this point's kind of the direction you're talking there. Is it Prasadam? Is that how you say his name?
Prasadam, Ajit Prasadam.
Prasadam. Okay. So the whole thing of theological pedagogy, which he was at Princeton, and he studied with James Loder, Loder is another Torrance influenced person. The Knight's Move has a whole chapter on Torrance within it. So Loder is another way that these Indian theologians have been exposed to thinking of Thomas Torrance, probably. And he was quite a creative person, Loder was as well. I have a friend who's did his PhD under Loder and has done 2 edited books of essays on Loder. So overcoming oppressed persons, the conversation you were just having about looking down on different castes, it sounds like some of what he was able to do deals with some of the social kind of issues that maybe Torrance hadn't. Your second point, or the third point on science and theology at work for humanity and koinonia. Again, this is, you're really beginning to engage the social structures that are implied by the conversation with the gospel as it impacts the structures of our related ways of being. The point 4 there, beyond conscientization. Can you give me a definition for what that means?
Yeah, he provides one, I think, that I refer to here. It's on page
Maybe you
50.
need to help me understand it better.
Sure. Let me read it out and then try my
Okay.
best to explain it. So page 319, footnote 58, he says, by conscientization, he means the process of raising one's critical consciousness about social, economical, and political reality and the formulation of action against the oppressive elements of reality. So awareness that leads to action, I think, is what he's trying to push at, right? Theology should address injustices in a concrete way, and he's doing this in the context of education and trying to remove, thinking along the lines of caste and oppression from a Christian perspective. So basically, more awareness that leads to concrete action that addresses the ailment in question. That would be how I would understand him in this context.
Which sounds a lot like it interfaces with the doctrine of the Holy Spirit. What is the nature of the work of the Holy Spirit in bringing us to, to act in ways that are consistent, resonate with the work of the person of Christ and reconciliation and redemption, that are going to engage these social kinds of issues, and that the Spirit is producing that fruit in communities as well, who would be overcoming those kind of oppressive structures and systems that are working from fear and control and power in the inappropriate sense of power, and move towards, there's the word again, empowerment, that the empowerment of this awareness to be thinking out of the life of the triune God who engages and transforms the structures that we even see with the Samaritans, that Jesus tends to use as his positive structures where everyone else sees them as the negative. He uses them as the Good Samaritan and the woman at the well and all these people to break up the social biases and do something. So would you say that that's, in a sense, that's what he's doing, that he's in this term? It's a fancy term that we need to learn to listen to the Spirit.
Well, he doesn't speak much about the Spirit in his work, but
okay.
I would assume that he is an evangelical,
okay,
and I think he would agree with you, Marty.
Yeah.
But from the work that I reference, he doesn't refer explicitly to the Spirit, at least in that section. But I think he would agree with that. He's somebody that champions Torrance in the Indian context. I haven't come across a lot of his writings. That's one of the things generally from the Indian context. You have a lot of practitioners, even if they have PhDs, they become practitioners because people have to wear a lot of hats here. You can't just write, you have to be pastors and you have to be evangelists and you have to go to house visits and do so many kinds of things that don't allow people the opportunity to write as much. But from anecdotal evidence, he's somebody that champions Torrance. It would be nice for you to get in touch with him.
Which thinker is this?
The person we're talking about, Ajit Prasadam.
As you brought him up, there's just an aside. I met him and knew him at Princeton Seminary in the summer of '93.
Wow.
When I started my Hebrew there, Ajit was there, and I would have lunch with him. We lived in the same building. So
wow.
That's trippy. you know. And I remember I said, Ajit, what do you do? And he said, I'm the general secretary of one of the largest Christian ministries in our part of the world. And I remember him well. So he was a really nice guy. Anyway,
Have you
yeah,
met
he
him,
was.
Stevan?
What?
Have you met him,
I
Stevan?
haven't met him, but I've heard about him.
Okay.
And I've heard that he's somebody that loves Torrance's work.
Yeah.
You know, so it would be really nice for you to try and, you know, have a conversation with him, Marty.
So it sounds like Matthew's going to be part of that too.
Yeah, he
What?
worked with Loader too. He worked with James Loader too. I remember.
Right,
Right,
right.
I remember he told me one time he didn't do really well on this paper, and Loader said to him, "Well, what does this have to do with your life in Christ?" So that was great, you know, because Loader was all about that. Anyway, that's trippy. Anyway, okay, keep going. Sorry, guys.
So one of the things that you don't have to come up with now, but I would be curious, Stevan, what you can see as a helpful way that Matt and I could interface with him that would further it. So, you know, what questions could we ask him? What could we offer him just to get that conversation going? I would want to go in, not just, hey, I had a conversation with Stevan and Matt knows you, you know, good to meet you. I mean, I just want to go further than that. So it would be nice to have some kind of thoughtful platform for engagement. And again, you can think about that and maybe send me an email or something.
Sure.
That would be great. The phrase the humanization of humanity sounds like the personalizing person a little bit, which is a very Torrancean.
Yeah.
You think that is that kind of from him?
Of course, he refers more to Loader's work than to Torrance, but since
Okay.
Loader is also influenced by Torrance, you know,
Yeah.
I think Torrance is playing some kind of role, but perhaps more so in the background.
Yeah.
Prasadam refers to Torrance, but more so in footnote comments rather than, you know, direct engagement with his work. But since
Right.
he's somebody in the Indian context who speaks a lot about Torrance, you know, he teaches a lot. He does a lot of work. You know, he's a very influential leader in India, and the fact that he really loves Torrance, I think, is something that we need to learn more about. You know, what about Torrance continues to impact his own ministry. The
Good.
mediation of Christ is a work he refers to in this work that I provide a footnote for. So, you know, Torrance continues to impact Ajit Prasadam's ministry because he speaks so highly of Torrance.
Yeah. Good. Well, Matt and I will attempt to talk to him, and then we'll loop you back in because
Sure.
it's, you know, your hearts may be knitted together. I love that phrase in Colossians 2, that your hearts may be knitted together. Sometimes the internet provides that knitting together process, and who knows, but for such a time as this conversation happened today. Who knows? And that Matt happens to be here who knew him at Princeton. So
Wow.
That's just trippy.
yeah.
Anyway,
So there it is. There's some kind of a divine appointment here, I think. Relational thinking is dismantling of hierarchies. Caste and patriarchal are two that are there, which of course I call myself a relational theologian. So I'm very interested in connecting with him over what that could look like and what are the processes of allowing for an appropriate relational theology to speak in ways in a culture where people feel like they're losing something. I assume that those who are patriarchal and at the top of the caste system don't want to give up what they have. Is that true?
Right. Yeah.
So there's the question of overcoming fear and asking, how do you empower these people to see their positions of power in different kinds of ways that are for the good of India, etc. So
yeah, just to clarify, Marty, the caste system is illegal, right? To oppress people along the lines of caste is not accepted. Generally, I think Christians are united on this with Hindus and Muslims and all others. It's just you see the ramifications or the effects of the caste even in churches. So
yeah,
that's the sad part. Of course, you see it in society as well, but I want to speak more along the lines of churches and how can the church address this issue.
yeah.
And I think in some sense, yeah. Go ahead.
I'll just say, if I could add to that, one of the things I'm dealing with as a relatively new pastor in my context, after a pastor who has been here for 38 years, who's a great guy, is getting people who are established to share power in a way they're not accustomed to doing. So
Right.
while we don't have a formal caste system here by any means, and like you say, it's illegal there, there is definitely kind of an establishment of power structures within a church setting. And a big part of my work right now, frankly, is loving. I don't say that, put it quite this way in the church, but I'm trying to dismantle these structures and open them up and creating relational connections
Mm.
that can then sort of subvert them and dismantle it from the inside out, because people hold on to power. It's familiar. It's what they, So anyway, it's that language is relevant to
Yeah.
my church context in the Pacific Northwest, in a wonderful, great church with
Yeah.
very talented people, but who are having trouble shifting into a more sharing the power among the leadership versus gripping power and holding on to it. So
I call that empowering.
yeah,
We
Thanks.
call that
Thanks for sharing that, man.
going alongside.
Yep. Paraclete.
Leadership.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. I'm going to go on to your third person, and his name's Stevan Tsoukalas. Is that how you say it?
Tukalas, yes.
Tsoukalas. Wow, I got kind of close to it. So he hasn't done as much, but he did some work on theosis. Has Mike met him?
No, Mike has not met him. Just a little bit about Stevan Tsoukalas. He did his, I think he has a master's degree from Harvard. His PhD is from the University of Birmingham. So very established evangelical,
Okay.
theologian of comparative theology. Yeah, so he is appreciative of Torrance, and I found that interesting. Just to see how many people have interacted with Torrance from disciplines that we wouldn't usually expect interactions with Torrance, right? We would expect, big name theologians interacting with him with theology, science, or Christology, or the Trinity,
Yeah.
but not necessarily comparative theology. So I found that interesting, which is why I document that in this section, just to show the scope of Torrance's, I guess, fans of Torrance all across the intellectual spectrum, which is quite encouraging to see.
Well, there's a bridge building piece there, right? I mean, if they're fans, then they're able to be in a conversation. Can you say anything about the person who he did this essay, Ramanuja? Is that his name?
Yeah, Ramanuja.
Yes.
So he would be, I think when we had this conversation last time, I think, aptly summarized Ramanuja is probably the Thomas Aquinas of the East,
Okay.
just in terms of his stature. So a very significant philosopher and thinker that Christians have interacted with appreciatively in the past. And here you see an example of that as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, an intellectual giant. And the fact that somebody is interacting with him and I guess pitting Torrance against him just shows the respect somebody has for Torrance as well. Yeah.
And is that article that he wrote in a place where people would find it, or is it buried away in a journal that doesn't get seen much?
No, it's available online as well.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah. The Journal of Hindu Christian Studies.
Okay.
And I think that's available online as well. Yeah.
That's in the footnotes, the link to it?
Yeah. 71. Yeah.
Some of these things, if it's available, I'd like to post a link to them on the Facebook site so that people could follow up on those. So if I can find the link for Boyd's doctorate and this, those would be helpful, I think, to get people to do some reading on those things. So if I can't find them, I'll be coming and looking for guidance.
Sure.
So the this whole idea of imaginative conversations, I think, there's a space of just the listening and the playing out of things that is part of the space that I hear the global thinking that you're proposing in the very title of this, is that we have these conversations that bring great thinkers together, and everybody wins just in the conversation, regardless of convincing. It's awareness, it's hearing and being heard. Yeah, the 8 similarities, and you listed 2 that are similarities between Torrance and the brilliant person of the East, incarnation in humanity. There are differences, but there are similarities. And so the suggestion there is that there are enough similarities that to note the similarities and the differences is just a way of not having to be convincing, but it's just saying we do have similarities and we do have differences. And to clarify those, we walk away knowing each other better. There's not a push for sameness, but there is a push for just respect and having heard and saying, we could even say we're friends now who don't think the same. And that's what friends kind of do, right?
Right. So I think Steven Tsoukalos is a good example of a comparative theologian who compares. So obviously he's familiar with texts. He's able to read texts in original languages. So he understands the philosophical worldview as well. Here he's dialoguing with somebody from the Hindu philosophical worldview. So he's intimately aware of that, but he's not afraid to point out contrasts as well.
Yeah.
And in his larger work, which I provide a footnote in footnote 77, he talks a little more about his methodology with respect to interreligious or comparative theology. You have some comparative theologians who see in two different religions more similarities than dissimilarities.
Yeah.
Tsoukalos is an example of somebody who says that is an inaccurate representation. He believes that there are more dissimilarities than similarities when we compare different religious perspectives on particular doctrine.
Yeah.
He also believes that you can seek to persuade. So he doesn't believe that all we need to do is just learn. He does believe you can persuade. But I think what he does provide is deep learning, before the persuasion.
Yeah.
And I think that is an aspect that, we can inculcate. Because I
that's
think we would agree with people who say that all religions are essentially saying the same thing.
Yeah.
Here's
At the University of Otago, they disassembled the religious studies department because they found all the categories were Christian categories, and they were just trying to cram the other religions into those structures and weren't doing anything that was really listening attentively at all. So I can't remember the name that they came up with, but I think it's that insight of if you're just trying to fit things within your vision of religion, that's probably not going to be a very good conversation. So that's part of the interest in what we mean by global, whether it's theology or, what word does allow us to have what we might call almost philosophies. Confucianism, Taoism maybe are more philosophies than they are religions. So, how do we bring people to conversation without putting up what appear to be barriers?
Yeah.
So in conclusion, you talk about TFT and the relevance for the Indian context, which I'm assuming you're saying there's a lot of relevance. There's a lot of good work to be done in the Indian context, and that having conversation partners, which there are some possibilities we've, talked about creating even today, and some we didn't even know were there, with the incredible Matt Young, who already has some of the pieces of that conversation partner piece in place. And then the need for global contextualizing theology. I think for me, there's just a continuing to say, what are the places where that conversation happens that aren't merely for professionals who meet in faraway places that are never going to be in the conversation. In other words, how do we really bring Torrance in a way that some of your people do to conversations that are both listening and speaking, and everybody gains from it? But it does require a host at some level for those things to happen. So the question of, where are the hosts? Where do we host people for those conversations? And what are the things that we would hope out of that to spread the kind of culture that is a listening and empowering kind of culture that would come from it? So that is something that out of our conversation today, I can see there's a real need for that, because it's real easy for it far away, not MySpace, and just to go, I'm kind of interested, but I don't even know where to start, kind of thing. But I think that today this conversation says there are places and people with whom one can start. And even the Torrance tradition provides a starting point in that. And there are others that we probably would discover along the way, like Loder, for example, who would also be part of that. Leslie Newbegin would be part of that. So anyway, those are all, I think, seeds that we can say flow out of today's conversation and can be further fill out the first of my three questions there. What still needs to be done? We need to figure out how to keep the conversations going. So your article, your chapter in this book it's a conversation starter, and it implies more conversations. And so that's something that we will work towards. How will the three writers mentioned here have their viability maintained in India? Do they have enough recognition? It's easy for theologians to drift away. I mean, even Karl Barth and T.F. Torrance, 99% of the people who I mention their names to have no idea about T.F. Torrance and Karl Barth, the two of the greatest theologians of the 20th century, and yet virtually unknown. So the question, is there a culture to bring to attention these people who you've worked with, and the potential for the value of Torrance and others also being exposed in those conversations?
Yeah, I think the legacy of Boyd continues. I think, like I was saying, we need to come up with a revised version of his Indian Christian theology with a critical introduction, perhaps.
By you?
I'm not, but I think that's something that, needs to be done. Not that people have forgotten about Boyd, but just to highlight his ongoing legacy. That work itself is testament to the significant impact he continues to make in India. And the fact that Torrance played some role in that is something, that I discovered when I studied Torrance. I didn't know about that connection. So I think Boyd doesn't need to be highlighted as much as perhaps some of the others. I think Ajit Prasadam's work, like I said, in the Indian context, it's hard for people to write a lot because they don't have the time, because they're doing so many things. So even if you have a PhD, you're required to do so much. But just highlighting the work of people like Prasadam and how he believes people like Loder and Torrance continue to impact his own ministry in terms of thinking, theological thinking, and how he's imparting that to others. People like Prasadam need to be highlighted more, I think, and perhaps through more conversations. Maybe like what we were suggesting here is to have him maybe, in dialogue with him in some form.
So can you, Stevan is alive as well, is that right? Two of your three are still alive.
Still alive, yes. So, Steven Soukalis would be another person to interview, Marty. He lives in the US. He's appreciative of Torrance's work, as evidenced in this article. And he's somebody that continues to write a lot. He's obviously written quite a bit from a comparative theologian perspective. He's written on Islam and Hinduism. He's done a lot of work on cults as well in the past. So he would be somebody to interact with as well, Marty, in this forum.
There could be something maybe with all three of you. Would that be good?
Sure.
We'll take it one step at a time, but I'm just trying to think of, to the whole idea of creating conversation partners. I mean, you can literally do that by inviting people to come and have a conversation, and then you become conversation partners. You've done the beginning part by writing a chapter and honoring their work, right? And so you have started that ball rolling. So I'm just looking for how to keep that ball rolling.
Yeah. I think that would be great, Marty, to have a conversation with them. Good. What I'm trying to do in my own work is try to see like my own work focused on the ascension in Torrance. I didn't dedicate a lot of space to looking at the practical implications of that doctrine. So I'm trying to take that up through articles. I'm hoping to write a few articles that are still pitched at the academic level, but at least in some of these articles, they try to envision some of the practical implications of his theological insights. So I'm trying to do that in some small way in my own work and encourage others.
Good. Well, when you get your doctorate published, we'll have you back on to talk about your book
Sure.
and make it visible to people as well. So that would be
Sure.
great.
The head
So
of
the
my
last
prayer,
question-
the head of
Is
our
that-
prayer group, right? I have a prayer ministry team at church. She wants to do an Ascension Day at our church. She went to a conference and heard about from this Canadian theologian Gordon Smith about the importance of the Ascension. And I know from Andrew Purvis that I work with him at Pittsburgh Seminary. He's always encouraging that too. So that was music to my ears. So I'll have to keep an eye out for your work. And because she's saying, I want to do this Ascension Day. How do we do it? So I'll have to look your articles up, Stefan.
Yeah, and Garrett Dawson's work, Matt. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. Jesus Ascended.
That's right.
He provides some examples in there of how to incorporate, thinking about the ascension in corporate worship. He gives some practical examples in his work. I would commend that.
Great, thank you.
Very good. So the last question there, what are you encouraging younger Indian theologians and pastors to do theologically? I mean, where are you directing the next generation?
That's a big question, Marty.
I know. I like big questions.
Yeah. I guess one of our challenges is integrating theology with praxis, broadly speaking. How do we do theology in a way that addresses specific issues? It's hard to do from, when you write a thesis, it's not always easy to do. So in some senses, you're preparing the person who would then go on to do several different things. So I guess shaping scholar saints, broadly speaking, would be something I would see as part of my own calling. Not that I'm necessarily doing a good job at it, but that I would see that as a big picture kind of vision that I hope to be imparting to the next generation, where we are scholarly, but also embody a Christian lifestyle. And I think that speaks more in our context, where there's a lot of focus on devotion. We didn't talk much about that, but within the Hindu tradition as well, there's what's called the bhakti tradition, which is basically where people are devoted to their own deities and manifest that through their lifestyle. And I think when they see Christians living out their faith, that is appealing to them. So more than what we say or write, it's how we live. I think that will speak volumes about our faith and love for Jesus. So yeah.
Good. Well, that sounds like a whole nother big, wonderful topic. So thank you, Stevan, for writing this chapter, for the life that you are living there in India, and we're glad for all the possibilities come. Do you have contact information for either Sukala or Prasadam?
Sukalas I do, Prasadam I can get, Marty. So
if you could get those, I would begin a conversation just asking about their availability for doing something. So that would be great.
Sure.
Good. Well, thank you for being here. And I'm sorry there aren't more people here, but I know people will be watching it as well. And it's been a very rich conversation. I think that it has been a very worthwhile time. So thank you again for staying up in the middle of the night. It must be, what, 3:40 there now or something?
4:30,
Yeah, close to 5. But yeah, it's been a privilege talking to you. Thank you, Matt and Bill, for your interactions and encouragement. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Very good. Well, many blessings on you. I don't know if you're getting up or going back to bed.
I'll make a decision on that shortly, Marty.
Okay, very good. Very good. And again, thank you all for being here today, and many blessings on you as you go on your day. So
Thank you.
care.
Excellent. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.